Good afternoon, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Patricia Barton, and I'm the Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Harnessing Behavioral Economic Insights to Optimize the Impact of Early Childhood Interventions. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the Consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 25 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, policy, and practice audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We are using GoToWebinar to host this webinar. All of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the question box on your screen to submit them. Today's webinar is being recorded. After the call ends, I will upload it to SRCD's YouTube channel and will share that link with all of you. If you have colleagues who are not able to make today's webinar but are interested in the content, please share the link with them. And now I would like to turn things over to our presenters to introduce themselves and today's topic.
Thank you for that introduction, Patricia, and thank you to everyone for joining us for our webinar, Harnessing Behavioral Economic Insights to Optimize the Impacts of Early Childhood Interventions. My name is Zolene Hill. I am a postdoc at the Bell Lab at the Institute of Human Development and Social Change at NYU. I'll be presenting together with my colleague, Michelle Spiegel, who is a junior research scientist at Bell, and Dr. Lisa Janetian is a PI of our lab. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a roadmap for our webinar today. First, we will start with an overview of behavioral economics, how we see insights from behavioral economics fitting into early childhood interventions, and Bell's approach to doing this work. Second, we will review three concepts in BE that our lab has applied in the context of early childhood programs. Third, we will close with a discussion of some broader consideration in behavioral economics. And we'd like to begin with a vignette about a parent to help ground our presentation. Annette is a parent of a 4-year-old boy, Aaron. She works a job with long, unstable hours. Annette's life is busy, but she's excited that Aaron is in Head Start this year. The family coordinator at Aaron's Head Start program invited Annette to participate in a parent support program. Annette is not sure whether she needs to attend because her child doesn't have problems. She's concerned that her family and friends may judge her if she participates in a parent program. The deadline to sign up was last week, but she's not even sure whether her changing work schedule will allow her to attend. This story provides an example of the considerations that may be common to parents as they consider participating in programs. There's uncertainty if the program is for them. They worry that they may be signaling deficiency in their own parenting skills or in their child if they attend a program directed at parents. And they may have work conflicts and not be able to make it. In our presentation and in our work, parents are the focal point because the ability of early childhood programs to be effective, whether they are child-directed programs or parent-directed programs, is largely dependent on parents' decision-making. And throughout this presentation, we'll come back to Annette's story. When thinking about how Annette will evaluate her decision of whether or not to participate in the program, the disciplines of conventional economics and behavioral economics provide two different lenses. Assuming that Annette is Homo economicus, conventional economics says that Annette will weigh all costs and benefits. She'll make decisions based on full information and analysis of this information, and she'll have stable preferences over time. However, knowing that human decision-making does not operate like a computer and instead operates with limited bandwidth, biases, and distractions, behavioral economics says Annette will have a limited cognitive bandwidth to fully weigh the costs and benefits. She will be influenced by what other people think and do, and she will be distracted by things in her daily life. Next slide. The lens of behavioral economics takes into consideration the demands of parenting and what it takes to be a parent. It takes working memory, emotional regulation, structural support, financial resources, healthy adult relationships, balanced mental health, grit, and humor. It takes a lot. So whether deciding to engage in a parent program or making decisions about how to engage with their children, parenting requires a series of small decisions every day. And we design programs as if parents make benefit maximizing decisions. However, we know that's not how decisions work. Parents have structural as well as cognitive barriers that interfere with their ability to fully think through and participate in programs. And for parents who decide that they do want to participate, there are structural and cognitive barriers that may interfere with their ability to follow through on their intentions. Now I'm going to turn things over to Michelle.
So behavioral economics is an approach to looking at human decision-making that integrates concepts from economics and social psychology. Don't be confused by the economics in behavioral economics. It offers a framework to be applied not just to economic outcomes, but to all domains that affect human capital development. Conventional economic theory contends that humans have stable, well-informed preferences, that they operate in self-interest, and carefully compare costs with benefits. Social psychology tells us, however, that the mind is like a muscle, and that mental resources such as self-control and attention are not limitless, that we are influenced by others and by our environments. So these disciplines together give us a broader lens through which to understand behavior. Next slide. In understanding behavior, the BE lens also allows us a greater set of tools and levers to influence behavior. So let's think about Annette again and her barriers to attending programming. Conventional economic theory, what is displayed in blue, allows for barriers that include the cost of attendance, for example, loss in work hours, that her other children need to be cared for, and that she may have no way of getting to the program. The levers to address these barriers in the blue lever bubble include providing transportation, childcare, and a meal. Social psychology tells us that there are other things at play, like she might experience stigma and fear judgment for attending. She's prone to procrastination, and her actions are influenced by others, what others want or what others do. These insights offer a separate array of levers to motivate behavior, such as affirming her identity as a mother, using choice architecture strategically to shape the context in which she is asked to participate, and leveraging social influences by letting her know what other parents think of the program. Next slide. Here you see an example of a theory of change for a parent program that targets low-income parents and children. The theory of change follows that with attendance, participation, and application of what is learned in the program at home will ultimately lead to better child outcomes. Parents like Annette, though, make many decisions at each juncture of this theory of change, which assumes a lot about Annette's behavior. Looking closely at Annette's decision-making will reveal drop-off points, which are points in the sequential flow in which parents are diverging from the assumed decision-making path, so that we can get parents back on the assumed path to optimize impacts of the program. This process also has another important implication, which is that outcomes such as program attendance or participation in the middle of the chain, on the last slide, are typically only included in implementation studies. A BE lens actually turns these outcomes into components of an evaluation of impact on the longer-term child development outcomes. Next slide. So our lab applies insights from behavioral economics to existing early childhood programs serving low-income families. It is one approach for addressing the challenge of parent engagement in programs and for achieving intended dose of interventions. We develop low-cost, light-touch interventions that fit seamlessly into existing programs that support early intervention goals. And all of this serves to support parents' follow-through on their own intentions. Next slide. Our research process starts with understanding the program experience in practice. In other words, how do users experience the program? Then we use the existing theory of change to map all of the decision points and drop-off points. We identify snags that are amenable to BE interventions. We then create and experimentally test the low-cost, light-touch, seamless BE interventions within the existing systems and processes. Next, we evaluate pre-proximal outcomes, such as attendance at workshops or number of parenting strategies tried. Then we retest interventions through rapid-fire experimentation, which allows us to reevaluate and readjust our interventions. Ultimately, as I mentioned before, we consider parent decisions in engaging with programs as integral to distal child development outcomes and measure those as well. We don't go in depth about this connection in this webinar, but are happy to share resources on this if anyone's interested. And next slide. Currently, our lab is doing work with the home visiting program, a public library system, and a Head Start program. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to talk about applying 3 specific BE concepts to a generic parents program. The 3 concepts are choice structure, social influences, and identity and affirmation, as there are 3 examples emerging in our work as influential to parenting and utilizing early childhood programs. We will first describe them and motivate their importance, and then situate them in the context of utilizing a parent program. So the first concept is choice structure. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. This concept is that the format of the options of a question can have significant impacts on behavior. So different choice structures shown to impact subsequent behavior include opt-in versus opt-out defaults and enhanced active choice. Choice structure often brings up conversations about respecting parent autonomy to choose. And if you have any thoughts about this, it's totally normal. And just know that we'll discuss ethics in the context of BE later in the webinar. Next slide. So opt-in versus opt-out is probably the most commonly known version of a choice structure. Opt-in versus opt-out is presumed consent versus required action to consent. Either way, there's always going to be a default. We know from the behavioral sciences that humans are prone to inertia. So it is important to recognize that choices may be more reflective of the effort required to choose than the choice itself. This choice structure is typically most effective in the case of a critical one-time decision, like enrolling in health insurance or not, which doesn't require follow-up action. Next slide. For example, we see in this chart that the default for organ donation greatly alters the number of people signed up to be organ donors. When the default is presumed consent or opt-out, rates are more than 50 percentage points higher than when people are required to opt in. This shows the extent to which inertia affects outcomes. This figure is a beautiful example of how people often stick with the option that requires them to do nothing. Default switches, especially in the context of organ donation, can be a sensitive topic. Richard Thaler, the economist who you may have heard just won the Nobel Prize for his work on behavioral economics, has evolved in his thinking around the ethics of opt-out organ donation. Like with Thaler, thinking around ethics is evolving quickly in the field and is always a front and center point in our discussions. But the point here is to show the effectiveness of choice structure on an outcome. Many of the programs in early childhood require continuous action for which a simple default switch might not sufficiently support. So another way to present a choice is called enhanced active choice. It encourages individuals to think about an important decision and avoid procrastination. The enhanced part of enhanced active choice involves framing alternatives in a way that highlights the positive or negative aspects of options, leading to changes in their relative attractiveness. Because a person is actively making a choice in this choice structure, subsequent behavior may also be more reflective of intentions. I will motivate the importance of enhanced active choice through this study by Keller and colleagues in 2011. In this study, authors randomized participants into 3 separate conditions. Via email, all participants were asked, imagine that you are interested in protecting your health. The CDC indicates that a flu shot significantly reduces the risk of getting the flu virus. Your employer tells you about a hypothetical program that recommends you get a flu shot this fall and possibly save $50 off your monthly health insurance contribution cost. Each message then ended with one of 3 distinct choice structures. In the opt-in condition, parents were asked to place a check in the box if you will get a flu shot this fall. In the active choice condition, they were asked to place a check in one box. I will get a flu shot this fall, or I will not get a flu shot this fall. And in the enhanced active choice condition, respondents were asked to choose between two alternatives. I will get a flu shot this fall to reduce my risk of getting the flu, and I want to save $50. Or I will not get a flu shot this fall, even if it means I may increase my risk of getting the flu, and I don't want to save $50. The percentage of respondents who agreed to get a flu shot is displayed on the graph. It shows that active choice is more persuasive than opt-in, and that enhanced active choice, or highlighting the implications of the alternatives, is more persuasive than active choice alone. Having described and motivated the importance of choice structure, I'll describe how our lab has thought about applying this concept to the domain of early childhood interventions. Imagine a parent program asking parents to sign up via a sign-up sheet listing their name, their child name, and their phone number, like the one you see on the left. It is a purely opt-in approach, which from our experience is a relatively typical way of signing parents up for programming. Instead, the parenting program could use an enhanced active choice, like the example on the right. Presenting the choice of attending programming in this way requires that parents like Annette make an explicit choice to participate or not, and does so in a way that gently highlights the relative attractiveness of each option. The options read, I will attend parent program and share and learn effective parenting strategies, or I will not attend parent program and will find other spaces to learn and share effective parent strategies. Work like this is incorporated into ongoing RCTs, or randomized control trials, that are expected also to launch in January.
The second BE concept that we're reviewing today is social influence. And now conventional economics would suggest that Annette would act independently and maximize her own self-interest when making decisions. And social influence elucidates that actually signals and cues that Annette gets from others could influence her decision and behaviors. So social influence refers to the ways in which our behavior is affected by what other people do or think. And two approaches to social influence that we apply in our work are social networks and social norms. A social network, next slide, is the set of actors with whom an individual interacts and has relationships. Information like ideas, behaviors, cues, and preferences travel within social networks and influence individuals' preferences and ultimately their behaviors. From several studies, we know that information is more likely to affect behavior when it comes from multiple ties and when it comes from someone with whom an individual has a strong tie compared to a weak tie. Next slide. Now, Facebook has been a very helpful tool for studying social networks and social ties. One study examined the effects of cueing social ties on product interest. Using the Facebook platform, researchers examined how Facebook friends liking an ad or a product affects an individual's interest in that product. So here on the left, we see an ad for Tough Mudder. In the different panels, you see the number of friends who like the product increase from 1 friend to 3 friends. Researchers found that the greater the number of your Facebook friends who like a product, the more likely an individual is to click on that product. Next slide. In a second study, the same set of researchers examined the effect of the strength of your tie on product interest. They measured the strength of your Facebook tie as the proportion of communication that occurred on Facebook. So a strong tie is someone who you communicate with a lot on Facebook, whereas a weak tie is someone who you don't communicate with a lot. Researchers found that if a strong tie connection was associated with an ad, the subject was more likely to click on the ad and to like that ad. So these studies provide 2 lessons. First, social cues can have stronger effects when multiple social network signals are present. And second, that social cues have stronger effects when they come from stronger ties. Next slide. Another approach to social influence is social norms. Earlier, I explained that information travels within a social network. A social norm is a specific type of information that can travel within a network. Social norms lay out the rules and standards understood by group members to guide their behavior. Essentially, it is the script of what we do. In the early education setting, it may be new to some parents, and they may not have norms about what participation looks like. So there may be an opportunity to establish norms in this new setting. Next slide. Let's take a look at a study that provides evidence of the power of social norms. In a study with hotel guests, one set of guests received an informational placard on their door. It read, "Help save the environment. You can show your respect for nature and help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay." Another set of guests received a social norm placard that read, "Join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment." Almost 75% of guests who were asked to participate in our new resource saving program do help by using their towels more than once. You can join your fellow guests in this program to help save the environment by reusing your towel during your stay. And researchers found that the guests who received the social norm placard were more likely to reuse their towels. So next, I'm going to show you how we take insights about social networks and social norms and apply them into outreach for parent programs. To leverage the existing social network ties and established norms, we develop materials so that actors throughout the preschool setting can play a role in setting a norm of participation. We've developed parent testimonials using quotes from veteran parents. We've developed video testimonials from parents that we shared using a text messaging platform. And we have also encouraged teachers to share a letter with their parents encouraging their participation. A third BE concept that we use in our work is identity and affirmation. Thinking of Annette, conventional economics suggests that if Annette perceives something to be beneficial, she'll go ahead and do it. But BE provides evidence that for some situations, despite being beneficial, they can be threatening to our identity, and we may be reluctant to engage in these opportunities. Fortunately, behavioral economics research also shows that for some individuals, there are ways to counteract this threat. Stigma, fear, judgment, and a reluctance to signal deficiencies in your skills or identity as a parent are common parent-reported psychological barriers that interfere with engagement in a parent program. The experience of identity threats leads to a variety of psychological responses, including stress, anxiety, vigilance, and avoidance of situations. Studies show that for some individuals, self-affirmation can help those who are subject to identity threat and mitigate the responses to that threat. Affirmations are effective because they provide the subject with a more expansive view of themselves and disarms resistance to situations perceived as threatening to one's self-concept. There are several examples of affirmations affecting behavior in education and health context, and I'm going to review an example of affirmations in the social support context. In a study conducted by Hall, Zhao, and Saphir, it was conducted in a soup kitchen in New Jersey. Researchers randomly assigned soup kitchen visitors, a low-income population, to participate in a verbal affirmation. Subjects responded to the prompt, describe an experience of feeling successful and proud. Results show that the individuals who participated in the verbal affirmation were more likely to stop for and pick up information about earned income tax credits and volunteer income tax assistance, two programs targeting working poor. So complementary to the many affirmation studies in education and health, this study shows that affirmations can improve interest and behavior towards social safety net programs. Next, I'm going to show you how we employ affirmations in parent programs. On the left, you see an affirmation postcard. This postcard highlights and affirms the many resources that parents provide to their children that often goes unacknowledged. On the top right is an example of a values affirmation that we encouraged our center partner to integrate into their parent program sessions. The prompt reads, what values brought you to our program today? Again, by prompting parents to think about and share their values, this activity calls to mind concepts and ideas and parts of their identity that parents care about and value, which we believe diminishes the effects of threats to their identity that they may experience by participating in a parent program. The bottom right is an example of how we apply affirmations in our work with a nurse home visiting program. The prompt reads, being a new mom can feel overwhelming sometimes, but you're doing a great job. What was one new thing that your baby has done since I saw you last week? And what is something that made you smile? This prompt affirms the new mother. It asks her to recall a moment of development that she saw in her new baby, and also asks her to recall something that made her happy. These are examples of everyday positive aspects of parenting that, again, go unacknowledged. So we've reviewed 3 concepts from behavioral economics: choice structure, social influence, and identity and affirmation. We've provided examples of how they've been used in other studies and explained how we use them in our own studies in various early childhood programs. Many of the concepts we discuss seem to be taken from the social psych literature, and that's true, they are. And in the context of early childhood programs, we develop materials that leverage these concepts mapped onto key decision-making points. Conventional economics would say that choice structure, social influence, and affirmations wouldn't matter in decision-making. But social psychology tells us that in explaining behavior, these concepts and many more matter. So we take these concepts and use them as levers at key points in a program's theory of change to support parents' intention to follow through with engagement. And here I'm returning to an image that we showed you earlier, showing a common theory of change for early education or early childhood programs. We discussed that programs require a series of parent decisions and behavioral follow-through at key junctures, but there are many opportunities for indecision and program drop-off. The idea is that behavioral concepts help us to better understand potential barriers, and they allow us to design or redesign existing outreach materials to parents to encourage their decision-making and support their intention to participate. Next slide. As Michelle mentioned, Bell works within existing community early childhood programs and home visiting programs. And here are some of our emerging findings. For choice structure, in one of our partner programs, we're providing parents with tips and affirmations via text message. For one set of parents, we added them to the text message program and allowed them to opt out. 3.8% of parents opted out. For a second set of parents, we informed them about the program and allowed them to add themselves to the text message program. Only 1.4% of parents opted in. Here we see choice structure and inertia in effect. Under the opt-out condition, 96.2% of parents are receiving information that can be helpful to them as they interact with their new baby, compared to only 1.4% in the opt-out condition. For social influence, we're still collecting data on the effects of our social influence enhancements. However, from our analysis of program data, we know that parents are more likely to attend the first few sessions of a program, and then their participation wanes. These first few sessions provide an opportunity for us to leverage social influence enhancements. And third, for identity and affirmation, we're still collecting our data in the field. However, we conducted an online affirmation experiment with over 1,000 parents with children under 5 years old. And we found that parents who were randomized to receive the affirmation exercise were more likely to express an interest in participating in a parent support program. However, we only saw this effect for middle-income participants. We're conducting follow-up studies to further explore this finding. Next slide.
So for part 3 of our webinar, we're going to transition to broader considerations in behavioral economics. First, we will discuss universal BE-inspired principles for any practitioners here considering applying BE in their own programs. Then we will discuss BE in the context of poverty, cost effectiveness, and lastly, ethics. The first broad consideration. There's a set of BE-inspired principles relevant for a wide variety of programs that are often called nudges, which I'm sure many have heard of. Nudges include simple reminders or simplified directions or personalized letters. Acronyms like EAST and SIMPLER are useful to remember these universal principles. Nudges and acronyms, however, do not encompass the breadth of behavioral economics, but are a useful guide no less. MDRC's BIAS project has applied nudges to a variety of social services using these principles, and I'll walk through one illustrative example of this. So in this example, the population was non-custodial incarcerated parents, and the outcome of interest was child support modification requests and receipts. The intervention group received a package with necessary paperwork to apply, along with a tip sheet of clear and succinct directions on how to fill out the form, and they also received a reminder to turn their application in. The control group received typical treatment, which was ad hoc outreach and written materials sent to anyone who requested them. So by sending out the forms to everyone, providing instructions and a reminder, the number of parents requesting a modification increased from 9 to 41 percentage points, and the number of parents actually receiving a modification increased by 16 percentage points. These nudges are relatively easy to implement and have statistically significant impacts. Next slide.
Another consideration in behavioral economics is BE in the context of poverty. And for our purposes, how does that influence participation in early childhood education programs? So BE provides a lens for understanding the cognitive constraints that parents in poverty experience. For individuals in poverty, there are 3 common cognitive traits or biases that are adaptive to the condition of poverty that may interfere with parents being able to fully consider participating in a program. First, individuals in poverty are likely to have a scarcity mindset, in which they focus on the family's immediate needs at a cost of thinking about the non-immediate needs. Second, they may experience cognitive drain, meaning that under constant pressure to think through how to maximize the family's resources, parents may not be able to focus on or think about anything else. And third, stigma. Being in poverty is a socially stigmatized condition. Individuals in poverty often have to interface with individuals, businesses, and safety net programs that may treat them with disrespect and judgment. This experience of stigma may cause parents to be defensive about or avoid engaging in new settings. And everyone has a finite amount of mental bandwidth. If we use that space to concentrate on one thing, it can be difficult to use it for something else. For parents in poverty, the scarcity mindset, cognitive drain, and stigma may make it especially difficult to think about and follow through on participating in parent-directed programs. It is important to know this because many publicly funded programs intend to provide services to low-income families and parents. And BE provides a lens for us to consider the fuller set of factors that influence their participation. There have been several studies that show that mental and cognitive processes are affected by the context of poverty. Here I'm describing a study that shows a causal relationship between poverty and mental function. Researchers tested the cognitive function of sugarcane farmers in India at 2 times. First was right after the harvest time when they had abundant resources. And second time, the next year, right before harvest, when the resources were scarce. This meant that the rich and the poor subjects were actually the same person, taking the test several months apart. Researchers find that these same individuals performed like different people during times of scarcity, losing nearly 10 IQ points and faltering in other measures of higher level thinking. This example from sugarcane farmers in India is important because it shows that poor cognitive functioning is not unique to those who are poor in America. And instead, it may be a more universal function of scarcity on cognitive ability. This and many other studies show the negative effects of context of scarcity on cognitive functioning. Knowing this, we should be thinking about how we can design programs to help individuals in poverty make decisions that are in their best interest. Next slide. We're going to skip this in the interest of time. We're going to move ahead.
Okay. So yes, interventions from behavioral economics lead to statistically significant impacts, as we've seen. But how do the impacts compare to conventional economic interventions? In other words, do B interventions make a meaningful difference from a cost perspective? Let's go back to early childhood for a second. There is now a very familiar estimate that roughly every dollar spent on quality early ed and care can produce more than a $13 return. This cost-benefit analysis, though, makes strong assumptions about parents' behavior. As we have laid out throughout this webinar, parents are busy, distracted, and resource-strained, and often make decisions that diverge from what is expected. What we are left with is a host of all-star early childhood programs that struggle with low-dose, erratic engagement and diluted returns on investment. Next slide. In this chart, you see a comparison between a conventional intervention and a behavioral intervention by cost and impact, which was number of individuals who enrolled in college among recent high school graduates. The behavioral intervention is the FAFSA experiment from 2012, which was a randomized experiment during which H&R Block employees facilitated the process of filing the FAFSA, which is a federal financial aid form, for its clients while they were present. And the conventional intervention estimated the effect of the Social Security Benefit Program, which is a federal subsidy for post-secondary education, on college enrollment. While the absolute impact was greater in the conventional intervention, with 18.2 percentage point increase in likelihood of attending college versus an 8.1 percentage increase, its relative effectiveness is significantly smaller. The behavioral intervention resulted in an additional 1.53 students enrolled in college per $1,000 spent, whereas the conventional intervention led to an additional 0.0351 students. So here we see that the behavioral intervention is cost effective because it gets us more bang for our buck. Next slide.
We're going to talk about the ethics of behavioral economics. So, next slide. The shaping of the environment in which decisions are made to overcome cognitive biases is criticized as sometimes being paternalistic. It is actually the basic principle in the political theory of libertarian paternalism. And some criticisms waged at behavioral economics include critiques that it relies on the assumed benevolence of the social architect. It assumes that the social architect knows what is socially desirable, and there's little to no accountability for potentially steering individuals into non-optimal decisions. Indeed, these are important considerations and ones that the field should continue to think about and work through. And as Michelle mentioned, Richard Thaler, who you all know, recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics, was previously a proponent of opt-out design for organ donation, but has recently stated that active choice is perhaps the preferred model. As we, and hopefully others who are joining this webinar, consider using behavioral economics insights in our work in the early childhood intervention programs, it is important to operate following rules for responsible application of BE. We must remember to preserve the freedom of choice. We must not be coercive or manipulative in our strategies. We must consider that there is always a default and think thoroughly about what that default is. And whatever we do must be easily reversible. Next slide.
So those are the broader considerations that we're discussing, and I want to wrap up by saying that at Bell, we apply behavioral insights exclusively in the context of parenting and early childhood, and that we're currently building a portfolio of applications and evidence with programs located in NYC, and are soon to expand to a project in Philadelphia as well. Next slide. And we'd love to keep in touch as we continue to learn more, and if you'd like to as well, you can do so by visiting our website, following us on Twitter, or sending us an email. And that's all for today. That's all we have. Questions?
So a few of our webinar participants sent in some questions, and I'd like to start with one. The question reads, have you heard of the accommodations framework, and how would you say behavioral economics dialogues with that perspective? And so the answer is yes, we have. So we're familiar with Myers and Jordan's accommodations framework. And for those who may not be familiar with that framework, essentially what it says is that when making decisions about parenting, or particularly early childcare, parents accommodate several competing pressures when selecting care for their children. And we believe that behavioral economics provides a complementary lens for thinking about the accommodations model. It provides a formalized lens for us to think about the cognitive barriers and the cognitive pressures that may be influencing parents' participation decisions. Someone wrote, how does BE help us think about parents of disadvantaged children with disabilities? And for that, we'd say that while their children may have a set of special needs, parents are parents, and they have the same types of cognitive barriers and biases that other parents have. So BE helps us to think about what those cognitive biases are. Also, it's important to note that we employ behavioral economics insights in the context of existing programs. For thinking about how to use behavioral economics insights with parents with children with disabilities, it's important to think about what programs or set of programs we're working with. What are the key decision points where parents may be experiencing inertia or drop-off? And we need to think through how we can use BE insights to design or perhaps redesign existing outreach materials. Someone asks, the question is, how does the issue of race and racism fit into this schema? We think that behavioral insights helps us think about race and racism, particularly when we think about the lens of social influence. And so I did some of my dissertation research on intergroup interactions and found that some of that can be difficult and rough, and that there may be difficulties with groups interacting with each other. And so again, what behavioral insights does is taking that framework and looking at existing programs and looking at what are those points where parents might be making decisions where social influence, particularly social influences that may have to do with race or racism, may come into play, and think about how the program can redesign itself or share information about itself that is maybe accommodating of parents' concerns around race and racism. What would BE, so another question we just got in is, what would BE say about incentive programs?
So that's a great question, because we're currently working with a program and designing behaviorally smart incentive programs. So incentive programs are very, come from the bucket of, conventional economics. They're a very conventional economic approach to motivating behavior. But we think, and we're designing ways to make them, more behaviorally smart. One of the ways that we're thinking about this is there's insights from the behavioral sciences that tell us that people are more averse to losses than they are to acquiring a similar gain. So if there's a way to somehow message that parents already are in possession of whatever the incentive that the program is offering is, we can leverage that insight that parents would value what they already own and would try to not lose what they already own, as opposed to trying to gain something that they don't already own. So there's ways that you can use loss aversion to message different incentives that have been tested in other studies that I can't name authors off the top of my head, but for sure, if someone's interested, you can get in contact with us and we can touch base about other resources around that.
Yeah, so something else, just a little bit to add about the incentives. We would say that it's important to keep the incentives small. You don't want to make an incentive so large that it's almost seen as a manipulation of the parent. And so incentives need to be seen as these small things to kind of get movement or get action or get a behavioral change, and not something that is, large and manipulative. Someone else writes in, have you done any work with BE for families involved in child welfare? And unfortunately, we haven't worked with any programs that deal specifically with child welfare, but to the extent that we have adults or decision makers that may be missing some following through with things, we can think of a host of different ways that behavioral economics might be able to inform that. So if we're thinking in the context of maybe making it to appointments with a child protective service officer, maybe something like timely reminders may be helpful. If we're operating knowing that parents, like all adults, and particularly parents in poverty, have a limited attention, and so the ability to provide them with timely information that's clear on the things that they need to do could be very helpful. Maybe also in the context of child welfare, helping parents adopt certain practices towards their children. It may be helpful to employ things like social influences, particularly social norms, where you're trying to get a larger, more long-standing behavioral change. Perhaps that might be a time to leverage norms. But again, when we're thinking about child welfare or any other program, we're kind of thinking of, okay, what is this program trying to do? What is this program's theory of change, and where are we seeing parents dropping off from what we would like to see their decision making to be? So someone writes, sorry, we're taking a second to read, it's kind of a long question. It says, based on your experience, what is one practice you would recommend to more traditional researchers or intervention providers in using behavioral economics to deliver programs in early childhood? I'm gonna kind of not answer with one practice, but say that Michelle actually spoke a little bit about the concept of EAST, or simpler, and those are using the acronyms of making things
easy, simple, accessible, timely.
Yes.
So these are just universal things that people can apply in their work that have been shown to move the needle, to move people at the margins. And I think it's also important to consider in this work, right, that we're not, this isn't a panacea. This isn't going to go in and solve the problem of low engagement, but it'll move people who are really at the margins, who are maybe going to attend, have thought about it, and just, didn't follow through on their intention. So it's really moving people at the margins, and there's universal principles that can support that. So using, making things simplified, personalizing things, using social influences, reminding people of things, those are all helpful, universal BE inspired principles.
Someone wrote, can behavioral economics insights be used as well to support the early education and care workforce? And to that we'd say absolutely. So I think behavioral insights, so there's a lot of questions like, can it be used here? Can it be used here? Can it be used here? And I would almost always say yes, because I think humans, regardless of the context, have a limited cognitive bandwidth. And I think they're always going to need things that, like reminders, additional information that comes at timely decision-making junctures to help them follow through on processing the benefits, the costs and benefits of various aspects of their decision-making, as well as following through on their intentions to make those decisions. So
wherever there's a decision maker, I would say behavioral economics could come into play, right? Because it's just considering conventional conventional things that get in the way of whatever decision, right? And also now introducing psychological or social psychological things that might get in the way of making any decisions. So in the context of supporting the early ed workforce, we've already kind of started to explore this with one program we're working with, and are really intrigued by doing this on a larger scale.
Someone wrote in, I'd appreciate a focus on the practical aspects of random assignment and how the process works in adequate sample sizes. And this is a really great question. And just to let you know, like, it is very difficult. The work that we do, we work with existing programs and we partner with them. And so for our research partners, they are actually the providers of these services and these programs. And for them, their primary concern is the well-being and quality of the treatment and services that all of their parents get. So you can imagine that in that context, trying to come into a center and say, you know, treatment control does not necessarily or does not always go over well with people who may not be as immersed in the research. And so we are always working, trying to balance the program's needs and develop behaviorally informed enhancements that fits as seamlessly as possible into what we're doing with the parents. One of the things that we try to underscore when we're working with service providers is you all already have a default. You're already giving out something. Now just, you know, let us work with what you're using and just change something just a little bit. So again, we're not coming in with these grand, big changes to programs that only someone gets and, you know, someone may not, but rather there are these slight changes that in many instances may be imperceptible to the parents who may be within the same classroom. So another thing to that point, working within these programs and having these very small changes, it's taking us several years to develop the body of evidence that we want, but this is, you know, it is both the cost and the benefit of doing this type of work in authentic environments. It just takes a little time, and we have to be maybe a little bit more gentle than we may be if we were doing this in a purely experimental environment.
And the gentleness also comes in the domain we're working in, because a lot of the evidence that behavioral economics has shown is not in the context of childhood and parenting. It's in less sensitive domains, like example, getting a flu shot, where enhanced active choice in a flu shot, you can be a little bit more harsh, I guess, in the way that you highlight the alternatives of getting a flu shot or not getting a flu shot. Whereas in the context of attending programming, right, we have to consider the welfare of the parents and the sensitivity of the domain and the topic. So a lot of times it's really tricky trying to navigate the insight that from behavioral economics within this context, which is unique in that we have to be much more and want to be much more careful of how parents perceive the materials, because of the nature of the context of where we're working.
So someone writes, have you collaborated in any international parenting programs? And the short answer to that is no. But given that we work in New York City, we do have exposure to very diverse, so that's racially diverse, ethnically diverse, nationally, linguistically diverse populations. And sometimes those different populations all existing within the same early childhood program. And so when we're thinking about some of the challenges that, you know, the programs experience and things that we're also thinking through are things like translation issues. But in addition to just like how language may change depending on the background of the parent, we have conducted some focus groups and interviews with parents. And we have found that parents from different ethnic and national backgrounds have a different interpretation of the outreach material. So even if we have a Bengali parent and an American parent, both speaking English, the way that these parents may be interpreting the language that's provided in the brochure material may look very different. In addition to language being interpreted differently, we also found that images may have slightly different meanings to parents from different backgrounds. So these are all things that we're very sensitive to, and we are continuing to work with our partners to try to figure out what is the best way that we can find something that is universal. And perhaps if we're not able to find something that's universal, trying to find a way that we might be able to personalize to parents in a way that is still scalable. Because all of this work that we're trying to do, we want to make sure that we're learning lessons that we can take to scale.
And also, just to add to that, although at the moment we don't have any current projects internationally, one of the PIs on our project is Larry Aber, who heads up the Global Ties Institute, which does research and evaluation on early ed programs internationally. So we do have his voice in our projects. And we're also in talks to collaborate internationally, actually. So we're not going to be exclusively focused on New York City.
Yeah, we've stepped out of New York and gone to Philadelphia, so already there. So someone asked if there are any books to recommend on the topic, and while there aren't any books that specifically look at BEE in the early childhood context, there are some great books that we would recommend that we have even in our office that we reference frequently. So we would recommend a book, Misbehaving by Richard Thaler. We would recommend Scarcity by Mulanathan and Shafir. Also books by Cass Sunstein, and anyone else?
If anybody has some time on the subway or in a car, wherever you are located, we also had on our last slide, I think, a podcast, a Hidden Brain podcast that talked nicely about the impact of scarcity on a low-income mother's day-to-day life, and showing how having a scarcity mindset can make problems worse. So that's also kind of a digestible introduction into how scarcity can affect one's functioning.
And also from the more resources page, we have listed there our website. And if you go to our website, you'll learn a lot more about the work that we do. But we also have a list of other sources that we recommend for you all to check out.
In the Bell Publications folder on our website.
Yes. I think we are out of time. And I just want to turn it back over to Patricia, but first say thank you all for your questions and for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much to both of you. I feel like we could go on with questions forever, but it is time to wrap up. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today for today's webinar. Especially thank you to our speakers for such a thought-provoking presentation. If you liked today's webinar, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. Please check the consortium listserv and website for information about upcoming webinars. If you would like to present on a webinar later this year, please see the information on this slide. And you can also join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, the quarterly newsletter, as well as other job and event announcements. I will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar. I know we had a few questions about this, that will include a copy of today's slides as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar, and that will be posted on SRCD's YouTube channel as well. Thank you again so much to everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.